Welcome to session 8 of our New Testament survey series. Today we are in the Gospel of Luke, and we'll be finishing our discussion on the Gospel of Luke before we move on to the Gospel of John in our next session. My name is Stephen Clybourne, and I am the senior pastor of Earl Street Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina. Today we will be working through pages 20 and 21 of our study guide, which you can find on our website, esbcgreenville.org. You just click on the resources tab and then the Bible survey class tab, and you'll find the study guide. And there in that same, under that same Bible survey class tab, you will see all the previous videos from the Old Testament survey all the way through the last session of our the previous session in our New Testament survey series. In our survey of the New Testament, we have looked at some background and introductory materials about the New Testament in general, and then we started by looking at Mark's Gospel, and then had 2 sessions on Matthew's Gospel, and this is the second session today on Luke's Gospel. So far, we have looked at some general introductory materials about Luke's Gospel, and then we spent quite a bit of time last time talking about Luke's unique features, which combined serve to present Jesus as the champion of the powerless, the advocate of those who had no power in, at least in respectable Jewish religion. We also talked about some of Luke's possible purposes in writing his gospel. And today we move on to talk about the structure of Luke's gospel. A lot of people don't realize that Luke's gospel is the longest book in the New Testament. And it includes a good bit of material not found anywhere else in the New Testament or in the other Gospels. And there are 5 major sections of Luke's Gospel. The first is chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 4, verse 13. And these are the introductory materials, the birth stories that Luke gives us, the pre-birth stories of Zechariah and Elizabeth, and then the stories of the birth of Jesus, and the stories of the circumcision of Jesus, and Jesus being presented to Simeon, and then the story of Anna, and following that, the genealogy of Jesus, traced all the way back to Adam in chapter 3, and just the temptations of Jesus, the baptism of Jesus, and all of those sections are included in this opening section of Luke's Gospel that I'm calling Christian Beginnings. Following that, we see Jesus in Galilee. Galilee was the region in which he was born and raised, and we see, as we did last week, we looked at his first sermon in the hometown synagogue in Galilee, and moving through that pivotal time around the confession at Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus gathered his disciples around him and did kind of a checkup on what the word was on the street. And from that point on, when Jesus said, "What are people saying that I am?" From that point on, in chapter 9, verse 51, Luke says, when the days drew near for him to be received up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. So this represents a big turning point in the life of Jesus. After the transfiguration, of Jesus. And well, after Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, and then the transfiguration of Jesus, then Luke presents this turning point. You can tell that that this is a time when Luke is showing that Jesus is now living with his back to the past and moving like an arrow headed for a target to Jerusalem. We're going to talk about this theme a little bit later today, that in the Gospel of Luke especially, Jesus was not a leaf that was tossed about by the wind. Jesus was an arrow headed for a target. And from 951 to 1944, Jesus began to make his journey toward Jerusalem. Once he got to Jerusalem, then there is the story of basically his passion, his suffering and death and resurrection. His death and resurrection begins in chapter 22 and continues through the end of the gospel. And as we will see, the time that Jesus spent in Jerusalem is central to the Gospel of Luke. So let's look at, this is kind of the structure. These are the 5 major sections of Luke's Gospel. Now let's look at some of the themes that are developed in the Gospel of Luke. The first theme that I notice is the predestination of Jesus, the predetermined outcome of Jesus's life and teachings and ministry. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is never taken off guard. The journey / destination motif is a very strong image in Luke. Jesus has a very clear sense of where he is going and why he came, and everything is proceeding in his life according to that predetermined plan. Now we see that really unfolding in 2 very definite ways. One is how Luke develops the theme of Jerusalem and presents Jerusalem as the city of Jesus's identity, and more specifically, the temple in Jerusalem as the place where the gospel begins. You might remember that the Gospel of Luke begins with the story of Zechariah offering incense in the temple, and it ends in chapter 24 with the apostles praising God in the temple. So the temple serves as a bookend on both ends of the gospel, from the beginning to the end. And in between, after the birth of Jesus, his parents brought him to the temple and presented him to the Lord. In the Gospel of Luke, they make pilgrimages to Jerusalem every year for the Passover. At the age of 12, Jesus was about his Father's business in the temple. Remember when his parents lost him and found him in the temple? The third temptation in Luke's gospel takes place at the pinnacle of the temple. And even during Jesus's Galilean ministry, Luke mentions Jerusalem 3 times, and Jesus isn't even in Jerusalem. So Luke provides 5 notices that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. It's just very clear by the way Luke tells the story of Jesus that Jesus's destiny and destination have been predetermined. And then, of course, the final section of Luke's gospel takes place while Jesus is in Jerusalem, the mockery of the trial and the crucifixion and death. In chapter 24, Luke brings this theme of Jesus's destination to Jerusalem to a close by situating all of Jesus's post-resurrection appearances in Jerusalem or near Jerusalem, rather than in Galilee as in Mark and Matthew. Jesus' post-resurrection appearances take place in Galilee, not in Judea or in Jerusalem in Matthew and Mark. But in Luke, his post-resurrection appearances take place in Jerusalem or right in that general area of Jerusalem. A second way that Luke develops this theme of Jesus's predestination is how he speaks of Jesus's divine necessity. There is a Greek word, it's a three-letter word, dei, transliterated into English D-E-I. But in the Greek language, the word dei means it is necessary. And so that is the way Luke introduces Jesus's strong sense of mission, which kept him moving toward the city of Jerusalem where he was to be crucified. And Luke develops this theme of divine necessity in several instances. First, he says that it was necessary for Jesus to be about his Father's business as early as the age of 12. Then Luke says it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things, or Luke puts those words in Jesus's mouth. It is necessary for the Son of Man to be handed over to the hands of men in chapter 9, verse 44. It is necessary for him to disregard the advice of the Pharisees, chapter 13, 31. It was necessary for him to suffer many things and be rejected in chapter 17, verses 24 and 25. And even after the resurrection, Jesus takes up this theme of divine necessity again. He is doing what he's doing because of this compulsion to do it, because of this predetermination that he would do it. So I would say that one of the themes that you see in Luke's gospel is the predestination of Jesus. A second theme that we find in Luke's gospel is just the meaning of discipleship. Luke expounds upon that more than the other gospels. What happens at the passion, that is in the suffering and death of Jesus, is really the culmination of a theme that Luke developed early on and throughout his narrative. In Luke, the 12 disciples are just a prototype of all of Jesus's disciples. They were not an exclusive group. Jesus's call was extended to all. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. And Jesus also made a distinction in Luke's gospel between the apostles and the disciples. The apostles are and remain disciples, but not all disciples in Luke's gospel were the 12 apostles. The journey to Jerusalem becomes a model for discipleship in Luke's gospel, and discipleship entails suffering. So when Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, he is modeling for us what it looks like to voluntarily take up a life of service and sacrifice. And all disciples are called to do that, not just the 12. A third theme in Luke's gospel is Jesus as the prophet. I already mentioned this in the last session, but Luke's very first snapshot of Jesus in his public ministry, Jesus takes on the role of a prophet in the synagogue in Nazareth. Now, this becomes even more profound and pronounced because during the intertestamental period, that is the period of time between the Old and New Testaments, which was a period of about 400 years, the prevailing understanding was that there were no more prophets, that God had said all God was going to say. But with the infancy stories in Luke's gospel, the spirit of prophecy really returns. All the major figures of the infancy stories are filled with this prophetic spirit, the spirit of God who enables them to speak in prophetic ways. The birth of the Messiah marked the beginning of a new prophetic age. The spirit of prophecy was returning to Israel. The synagogue sermon of Jesus in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 31, portrays Jesus as assuming the role of the prophet as he was reading from the scroll of Isaiah 61, and the prophet being rejected. So for Luke, Jesus is one in a long line of prophets whom God had sent with the offer of salvation. And like the prophets who preceded him, Jesus was also rejected. But the distinguishing trait of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke is that he is more than a prophet. He is the prophet, the premier prophet, God's final prophet. And the last theme that I see emerging in Luke's gospel is Jesus at prayer. Luke, more than any other gospel writer, portrayed Jesus as a man of prayer, one who prayed regularly, one who prayed sometimes all night long, and one who prayed especially at significant times in his life, such as his baptism, the choosing of the 12, the asking the disciples for a confession of faith, the transfiguration. At significant milestones in his own life, Jesus is portrayed as praying before and praying through those episodes. And not only did Jesus model prayer by the way he prayed so regularly, but Jesus was a teacher of prayer. Jesus taught about prayer in the Gospel of Luke. And so therefore, at the critical time in his life in the Garden of Gethsemane, Luke has Jesus kneel rather than fall on the ground, writhing in anguish and agony. No, in Luke's gospel, Jesus is at peace when he is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He kneels, he assumes the posture of prayer near his death, just as he had throughout his life. And that's an important lesson for us all, because those of us who have a disciplined life of prayer, that is, those of us who are caught up on our prayers, those of us who pray regularly and at special times in our lives, you don't need to writhe around and panic and agonize and fall on the ground. A lifetime of prayer can be a source of strength on those occasions when one is not only seeking God's will for oneself, but is also called upon to help others who seek desperately for guidance and strength. So the focus in Jesus's prayer life is his submission to the Father's will. And the Father's will, as we have seen, is predestined, predetermined. And Jesus is just living a life of submissive obedience to what God was calling and leading him to do. Luke's gospel is one of maybe my most favorite of the four gospels, because of its focus on people who were powerless, people who had no standing in society, people who were on the margins of society. And Jesus said that he had come to preach good news to those people who had so little good news in their lives prior to his coming. Well, next session, we will begin looking at the Gospel of John. And I hope that if you have time before that session, you'll read the Gospel of John or start reading the Gospel of John. And I hope that I'll get to see you then. And again, I encourage you to get in touch with me if you want to talk about any of this material or ask about any of it. I'd love to have that conversation with you, and I hope to be able to talk to you and hear from you soon.